My name's Kathy Baldwin. I'm an anthropologist in the urban planning team with the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C., the only social scientist in the urban planning team, I must add. My question is a bit really in terms of methodology. In terms of incorporating a cultural perspective in risk assessments, obviously field work and kind of micro-level anthropological, psychological, sociological methods would seem like the best way forward in terms of gathering that kind of local data. I just wondered in terms of donors and scaling up and making sort of micro-level findings more applicable in wider geographical domains. There's always this kind of difficulty of creating survey data around psychological, cultural, perceptive elements. It's incredibly difficult. So I wondered if there are any thoughts on sort of the issue of the best methods of getting at a cultural assessment and the issue of scaling up in terms of attracting money.
Okay, thank you. We'll take one more in here in the room, and then I've got two online at the moment. Let's take someone from over here. Yes, back row.
Hello, I'm Tim Ingram from Tier Fund. I just wanted to pick up on a point you'd said about obviously the importance of culture in disaster risk reduction. What your views are on organisations working in partnership with religious organisations who obviously have access to the grassroots and have a true understanding of the dynamics and the different cultures within their populations.
Okay, was that for the whole panel or directed anybody in particular?
To the panel, yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to take the two from online. I'll take 3 or 4 questions each round and then ask our panelists to respond. So 2 from online, and then we'll capture the other in the room questions in a minute. So the first question is from Raj from IDRC. My question to Terry, you emphasized on changing the frame of reference. A, do you think there's a space emerging within the DRR discourse for this? So do you think there's a space emerging within the DRR discourse for this, the changing the frame of reference? And if you can cite some examples, that would be appreciated. And the second question is from Kelly at Plan International. How to ensure a culturally sensitive approach to DRR does not excuse or reinforce power relations and gender and patriarchal norms, which can reinforce vulnerability. So why don't we start with Terry? Are you prepared to start?
Yes, fine. Yes, 4 very good questions which require quite a lot of response. So thank you for those. Kathy's and Kelly's have some degree of overlap, so I'll try to deal with those in parallel methodologies and how not to reinforce power relationships. I think the first thing to say that it's not easy. So the argument of the report is that it's not easy, but we can't carry on as we are at the moment. We do have to find a new way of framing it. And I think Kelly's point about not reinforcing power relationships is incredibly important. And what, going back to the first question on methodology, I mean, we don't always have to do a cultural analysis from scratch. As Mo was saying, there's a hell of a lot of knowledge that's already out there that is not being used in DRR by DRR organizations or organizations that do DRR. So, for example, in the Bhuj earthquake in Gujarat, India, in 2000, I think it was 2000 or 2001, a lot of the problems that arose in the giving of aid and reconstruction in that, which were related to caste and gender, more as anyone who had knowledge of India could have told people what to expect and how to handle it better. And the power relationships were reinforced. Now, sometimes it's extremely difficult because in disaster preparedness or disaster response, it would be impossible to change power relationships. But what we have to be looking at is, do we actually subscribe to the idea that we foster the recreation? Because building back better in some cases means not having the power relationship that was there before. And that is extremely difficult to deal with. But unless you're actually aware of that to start with, then we're not going to be doing a very good job. So the methodology that we need is in Chapter 7 we have actually 2 suggestions for organisations that want to do adaptation to climate change or disaster risk reduction. 2 sets of activities. One is to help them understand people's own culture, and the other is to help them understand the organisation's culture. There are 2 things that need to go on in parallel. So we now need anthropologists who analyse organisations, as well as analysing the local people. And unless the organisations are prepared to be reflective of their own behaviours, their own beliefs, for example, the belief that all organisations have in the magic of community. Saint community solves every problem. There isn't, in the last 20 years, in relation to development, there isn't a single problem that I can think of that has not been solved by putting community-based in front of it. You've got community-based natural resource management, community-based first aid, community-based health care, community-based ecosystem management, and community-based disaster risk reduction, and community-based adaptation to climate change. Community solves every single problem. Well, the first thing that institutions need to do is to understand their own culture. Why are they engaged in this belief in something for which there is very little evidence? So it's about, we need an anthropology of organisations as well as of the people.
Thank you. Tim, I don't know if you have any comments you'd like to make on any of those.
I heard the
questions.
donor word mentioned in the first one.
Yeah.
No, I think it's. I think your question is about how much time, effort, and resources can we put into getting this sort of really crunchy data. Is it how well you can? I think sort of problem analysis and analysis on the ground is something that's lacking not only in this but in a lot of other things. I think relating to what Tim said from Tear Fund, I mean, you know, sort of people who are partnering with, you know, local agents, national CBOs, I think is one way. When I was working for Oxfam, where we'd had a sort of a presence in a country for 20 or 30 years, we generally did our humanitarian responses in a better way than if we just flew in and didn't have those connections, didn't have those sorts of linkages. So I think that, you know, when we do go in, we do need to take, you know, the whole political, the whole gender perspective, the religious perspectives, and it becomes very complicated, but that's kind of the world we're living in, and we have to do as much as we can. If it's a big bang and we just fly in, there's going to be less of that. If we actually have a presence, we can do more. And I think it's something we need to invest more of to get the data and the sort of knowledge, perhaps.
Thanks. Nick?
I mean, I like to think that we've got a very systematic approach to understanding the local context that we're working in. And I think to some extent we do. Right? If you take a typical hierarchy of planning tools that we use, and obviously you want to have a country office, it's got to have a country strategy. We've got to have a strategy for that office. The foundation for doing that work is an analysis of children's rights in the country. So we do what we call a child rights situation analysis first, but that's founded on literature and other documents that are available. It's founded on interviews with sort of key informants. It's founded on discussions with groups of children. And we make sure we don't talk to groups of children all together, all the boys and girls in one room, or all the age groups. That's definitely separated. So you start with this child rights situation analysis, and then you go into a country strategy process, and that can take quite a few months. And then below the country strategy, of course, come programs and projects. So you've got a sort of systematic approach to doing this, and of course the other factor is that we've got lots of local staff. Nearly all of our staff are nationals, citizens of the country, and I know that there are factions within any country as well that's an issue, but the fact is that we're there, as Tim was saying with Oxfam, we're there for the long term. You know, we are confounded sometimes by short-term funding cycles or the need to rush quickly into producing a proposal, especially for humanitarian work. But then there are new instruments, and I think DFID's pretty good with this one as well, which they call crisis modifiers. We try to make our programs flex and adjust through the period of the cycle of the program. and there is literally an instrument called a crisis modifier, which needs a new name definitely, which is a pot of money in effect pre-agreed with the donor, and which becomes available according to certain triggers, and those triggers are decided by a discussion with the community, so-called, and I hate the word community just as much as Terry does, the community of practice, if you want. Those triggers are decided and agreed in advance, so when a certain situation arises, money can be spent that wasn't actually in the main budget, and you can adjust your whole program according to a pre-agreed term. So that's an instrument for sort of reflecting. I mean, as to our use of anthropologists and sociologists and behavioural scientists, I suspect that we're not formally, but I know that amongst my colleagues there are people who've got degrees in those topics, and certainly I know that we try to be sensitive. Whether we really are sufficiently is a moot point.
And the process you described, do you think that reflects the organizational culture? I mean, there's a sort of self-awareness about using it.
I think, yes. I mean, obviously all organisations have cultures, and we're very different to Oxfam and ActionAid and Tear Fund, and distinctive in different ways. So we have definitely got an organisational culture. And some people question some aspects of that, and quite reasonably too. I think all organisations should question their cultures constantly. But I think that the attempt to be rigorous is a reflection of the culture of the organisation, and the attempt to respect and value the different cultures that we're working in is also a part of our organisational culture as well, I think.
Thanks, Nick. Mo?
I have a response that might just cut across the 4 questions, and I have a problem with anything that looks like one size fits all, and that sort of search for the holy grail of assessment methods or methodologies that can be applied anywhere. Contextualization is everything, particularly in disasters. And even the term itself, disaster risk reduction, well, what exactly are we trying to reduce? Because if you look at it and you unpack it a little bit, then you can see that what we're actually trying to reduce sometimes is exposure, is not actually risk. And that's what it comes down to. That doesn't achieve a lot. That doesn't achieve much. You have to do it again and again and again. So we need to question that first. How much of this risk is really embedded in cultural beliefs? Can we change that? Can we change it? Should we, in the first place? So that's kind of bordering on arrogance here. Is that sort of within our power to change? And if it's a prerequisite that you would actually get over this risk if there is a change of culture, how long will that take? It does change, it can change, and it has changed in certain cases that I know of, and some of them I worked on. But we have to be realistic that it's beyond one assessment, it's beyond one project to effect that change. And for that change to happen, we have to change with it as well. And I agree with what's been said now, that if we have the kind of organizations that are set up to effect change but are very resistant to change themselves from within, then we'll continue to have that problem. So this calls for what I term homegrown models. We need to allow that. Beyond that, country offices are staffed by nationals. How much autonomy do country offices have? How much space do donors allow? You can have an overall policy, you can have an overall framework, but how much space do country offices are allowed to actually define which parts of any cultural practices are to be confronted head on if they are against human rights, for example, if they're what we sort of universal stuff, or power relations. And how do you do that? And what's the time frame for that, rather than expecting it to be within the lifetime of a project? There is stuff that we did 25, 30 years ago that's just beginning to yield benefit in it. So we need to understand time differently, the time scale differently with what we do. And that has an implication on the assessment methods that we devise.
Thank you.
There were 2 questions that haven't been addressed yet.
Yes, I was just going. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
So Tim from Tier Fund asked about partnerships with religious organisations, and Raj asked about is there a space emerging for DRR and a discussion in the context of culture. Well, Raj's point, I think we're part of the process of creating that space. This is perhaps the beginning of opening up that space. I think Nick has quoted from the OCHA resilience guidelines, which is another opportunity. And there is also UNESCO, which has a section which deals with culture and risk in particular, but not only heritage assets, both physical and non-physical heritage assets in relation to disasters. They are supporting very strongly the inclusion of culture being incorporated into HFA2. So I think with IFRC and us in this room and others pushing for this, there is scope for opening up this space. But I think it will take time. It may not come in HFA2, it may take a lot longer, but I think we have to keep arguing for this, in particular around the extra needs that will come with climate change. As regards the partnerships with religious organisations, I think the overriding criteria there for me would be what is the outcome for the people. And I would be personally against any organisations in preparedness or response which is favouring one religious group over another. So I think that is probably true of most of the people in this room or listening on the internet, that there is an embeddedness in how we should behave, which is not discriminatory, and which is religiously neutral. I don't mean that that's easy, because sometimes people may perceive organisations as being from one particular religion rather than another. So I don't mean that it's easy, but I think that the upshot should be that people are able to receive protection from disasters or response to disasters without any discrimination. So I think that would be my own personal criteria.
Thanks very much, Terry. Okay, we've got more questions in the room. Yes, over here to the right.
Thank you. My name's Helen Stafsky. I'm from Islamic Relief Worldwide, which is a humanitarian organisation that serves people of all faiths and none. I just want to push a little bit further on this idea of positive religious beliefs, because although you talk about in the report the role of culture and religious beliefs in shaping risk, you seem to, at some points, really be implicitly asserting that people need to move beyond religion, move from a religious to a secular understanding. And I think that that's wrong. I think that actually what we're looking at is how do religions adapt to changing circumstances. All religions have environmental sustainability as core to them. And it's really just about bringing out those beliefs. So it's not just about working with faith-based organisations who understand religious groups. It's actually about promoting positive religious beliefs around risk. So Islamic Relief works on something called Eco-Islam. We do an online training module where we use Islamic perspectives to promote environmental sustainability. There's lots of other religions doing that as well. And that really does challenge the idea of particularity. You have to work in particularity. You can't work neutrally with religion. And this goes back to understanding anthropology and behaviour change. And the second part of the question is, how do we get DFID and other secular donors to get out of their comfort zone and actually support projects that might on Eco-Islam or on Christian stewardship? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
David Jones from Rescue Global.
Please wait for the microphone. Yeah.
Sorry, David Jones from Rescue Global. We're an NGO that deals in the response and also the disaster risk reduction space. Just want to tell you something that was discussed at the disaster risk dialogue in Manila last week that we attended, and then ask your opinion about this. And this was, I think it was sponsored by IFRC and other organisations, but it just struck us listening to what was said at the conference from the head of the Philippine government and then the head of UN OCHA at the time. There seemed to be a tension, which we seem to think might be a tension between the development space and the response space. And I want to ask your opinion on that. But I'll tell you what the two things that were said. Senator Solomon, the head of the Department of Social Welfare that leads on disaster response, her keynote speech said that the when the UN declared a level 3 disaster in response to Super Typhoon Haiyan that we're coming up on the anniversary of, that level 3 response pretty much disempowered Philippine government, was seen almost as kind of a very kind of an overly aggressive act that turned off local responders, local government, and then disempowers them from learning in that cycle, because international agencies turn up, they do the response, they then leave, and there's no real resilience and capacity being built. And then she said more about financial transparency and the legal status of that. Separately to that, the report of that conference, though, said that the response to Haiyan was very, very well done, and there was no real issue within that. When we've come back and talked about that, and I'd like to have particularly, Mo, your view on this about culture of the organisations in the response, and probably Terry also about in the capacity building space. We think there might be a real conflict there between what humanitarian organisations do in the development world, which is regulated and it's very well structured, and what they're now doing in the disaster response space, which is not regulated as such. And it seems to be that the models, the modalities of response and capacity building, there just seems to be a real challenge there between organisations that want to deliver aid, and that's what they're funded for, and that's what they deliver. But what actually might work better in disaster risk reduction, which may be capacity building, there seems to be, we think, an inherent conflict there between the people who do response and reduction and where they actually come from in their cultures. I'd like to hear your view on that.
Thank you. Anyone from this side? Tom.
Thank you, Wendy. Tom Mitchell from ODI. I was struck by some of the presentations which appeared to place risk perception within the kind of the context of culture, and therefore advocating that understanding risk perceptions more is a really important part of successful disaster risk reduction programming. But on the flip side, I wonder what the panel felt about the kind of the counter argument that actually public and individual understandings of risks actually relatively quite narrow in terms of the entire record of disasters that goes back hundreds of thousands of years, very much because the breadth of human memory is quite constrained and often bounded by particular aspects. And yet recognizing that some of the natural hazards that people face do have the kind of return periods over much longer periods of time, and the fact that climate change may be changing the frequency and magnitude of those, and what that actually means for responsibility for acting on those kind of risks, and how that may or may not be in tension with the risk perceptions that are expressed, which is really probably a wider question about the relationship between kind of state and the citizen and responsibility for disaster risk reduction, and whether or not actually there are some risks in that profile that maybe sit outside a kind of a common risk perception, where actually state has to take responsibility, which may be actually quite challenging for ownership, particularly at the local level, and therefore challenging for potentially the long-term sustainability of particular DRR programming.
Thank you. I just want to, there was a residual question here from Raj around, let's see, to Terry again. How does the private sector fit into this whole debate of culture in DRR? And Tina Gunther, and I know that's 5 questions, but it's just that her question is, she's a student in political science in Berlin. So she was saying that in addition to Raj's question, how are private security firms seen in the context of DRR? So maybe the private sector is one area we could talk a little bit about. I think I'm going to go to Mo first this time.
Okay.
Yeah.
David, that tension comes up sort of time and time again, and it wasn't just in Haiyan. And the reason for this, you would know it better than anyone. Disaster response and disaster recovery planning has to happen before a disaster, not after. But it doesn't. And it doesn't because there aren't any resources for it, because nobody invests in it, and it only when it happens, then OCHA deploys, UNDAC comes in, it does the assessment, etc., etc., etc. Now, the PDNA is being revised now, the post-disaster needs assessment is being revised now, but the modalities and the mechanisms is still there. And that sort of come parachute in, take over, run it, because of the pressure that is being put on the whole system to achieve that. You've got a reality on the ground, you've got inundation, you've got people who have been displaced, and you have very low capacity within the government system itself, and you've had no investment in the time preceding a disaster for the formal government structure to take part in that. And that tension, unless we change that, unless we not just use every disaster, but unless we allocate enough resources for what's called peacetime, if you like, pre-disaster, in-between disasters, to really build the capacity of the national, regional, and local response mechanisms. And then when something happens, when the next one happens, then you have procedures in place that you're working together. Unless that happens, you're going to get that scenario time and time again, whether it's on the scale of Haiyan, Haiti, or even smaller disasters. But that's, and in real terms, that's not actually a disaster issue, that's a development issue. That's local government, municipalities, emergency systems within the country itself. Do you want to respond to Tom?
Sure.
Did.
To that one, yeah.
Okay, to Tom, one of the questions that we don't ask is the social contract, is the state-society social contract. You have a classic one in the developed world. You pay taxes. The state provides law and order, security, protection, etc. You don't have that in developing countries, or in some developed, more so the case in fragile and failed states, for example. Who steps in to fill this vacuum? And we work in it. So that's an added complexity. And to what extent, and I'm still questioning that, to what extent some of these programs, some of the disaster risk reduction or development program actually addresses the social contract between state and society.
Terry.
Can I follow up? Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. Perhaps take Raj first. Private sector and its significance or role in relation to culture and disaster risk reduction. I really don't know what to say to that. I think we have to analyse what you mean by private sector, because it ranges across a whole range of things, including Gunter's point about private security firms, which I think many people in the humanitarian sector are extremely suspicious of and wary of. And a lot of that was covered in Naomi Klein's previous book on disaster risk some years ago. So we have that kind of victory of neoliberalism in relation to the aid industry, which is extremely dangerous in my view, and that is giving favours to particular parts of the private sector, especially in the United States, of companies that have been found to be disreputable and harmful in many ways. So it depends what kind of the private sector you mean. The private sector is made up of so many things. I have a hope that the private sector is going to solve the renewable energies issue for climate change. And there was very good news this week from Denmark, where it appears that the wind energy is overtaking energy supply from fossil fuels, and that is private sector driven. The rapid explosion of solar panels and in China, within China, then exported solar panels to other parts of the world, is private sector driven. So there are some things which we can look on as being positive, but in many other cases the private sector is the cause of the problem. We have the situation in 2012 when the 200 leading energy companies spent over $600 billion on exploration for new oil and gas and coal. This should be left in the ground. That is, if you compare the money that they are spending on exploring for new fossil fuels with Oxfam's annual budget, we're talking about 100 times greater to cause the problem, and we come along trying to fix the problem. And I think this is a concept which I'm suggesting we all need to use now, which is what I call the cost to damage ratio. What is the possibility that we have to cure damage from our resources by comparison with the amount of resources that are available, in particular to the private sector, to cause the damage? And I think that ratio is generally the order of 1,000 to 1. We're trailing on with tiny amounts of resources to try and fix problems which just get worse and worse because they have more resources. And that overlaps a bit with Tom's question. If I understood it correctly, Tom, I think I would answer that with two aspects to it. One is that what is the responsibility through the social contract or whatever of organisations to help protect people from risks which they may not give priority to. And in the examples that I gave, many people do not give priority to the major risks, but we, NGOs, governments, know that those risks exist. So I think it's about finding the cultural basis on which we can help to support people to deal with those risks. And that means much more integration of development with disaster risk reduction and with adaptation to climate change. So there is a lot of hope next year with these three areas coming up together in 2015 that we will see more integration. Because I don't think we are going to get people to engage in disaster risk reduction unless their development problems are solved or you do them side by side. In the report, we've published this infographic, as the jargon has it, on pages, if I can find it, sorry to take time to do this, this infographic, which is on pages 19 and 20, which I don't know if the camera can pick that up. You can all find that. I'm holding it upside down, I realise. But if you look on this, you'll see that most of the problems of people dying in the 20th century, which is what these bubbles show, were not related to natural hazards. You have to look really carefully at this to find the natural hazards. They're down here. If you compare it with road traffic deaths or malaria or TB or war or other factors, they are much, much bigger. And I think that we have to get a sense of proportion about what our role is, and our role should be much more linked with the problems of development. And if we can help people solve their water problem, their malaria problem, their job problem, their poverty, then we are going to be much more likely to be successful with disaster risk reduction. The second aspect of that is the responsibility of the state. For example, this is not bashing India, although it's just an illustration. You could apply this to many countries. But India has, in the last 20 years, had between 7 and 9% economic growth each year, almost every year. So after 20 years, what is the sign of that being translated into better healthcare or better nutrition? Very little. So what is this government not doing where it should be collecting more taxes in order to supply a health service to its people? And this is a big question. And this is where I would also question our concept of community and the role of NGOs. In Britain, until 60 years ago, if you didn't have money, you couldn't call the doctor, and you probably died if it was serious before the National Health Service. We didn't expect in Britain our health problem to be dealt with by having NGOs going around doing injections and giving treatments like that. It's top down. And I think in response to Tom's question, there should be far more responsibility taken by governments for their citizens in terms of collecting taxes and providing these services, which should be basic services in the 21st century. If you can send a satellite to Mars, you should be able to give children good health care in an Indian village. Thanks, Terry. We're running out of time, but I wonder if we could just have a few brief remarks from both Nick and Tim.
Well, I tend to agree pretty wholeheartedly with what Terry just said there. I think I'd see DRR as a governance issue. Ultimately, it's not a technical issue. It is indeed about the relationship between state and citizen, and quite clearly citizens don't necessarily have a clear understanding of all the risks that face them and the society, and governments have that responsibility to deal with them. And in an ideal society, we wouldn't need disaster risk reduction programs at all. I would say the children's approach to the post-MDGs, the SDGs, so on, is our top line sort of call is to do with inequality within societies, and below that come all the other goals to do with health and so on. And with Ebola, for example, our response to that is obviously very much along the line of what everybody else is doing at the moment, which is trying to deal with the immediate issue. But behind that, there's a very clear statement about improving the quality of health systems, universal health care, and that's within our post-2015 MDG, SDG goal framework as well. So I'm standing right by Terry on this one.
Thank you, Nick. Tim, would you like to have the last word or the penultimate word before me?
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, I agree with what the panellists have said, especially to Tom's question, which I think was, sort of, yeah, I understand where the question's coming from, and I think it's something that we're always struggling with. I think just to say about the culture of DFID, I mean, I'm just aware that there's, the woman from Islamic Relief hasn't really been to yet, and the nature of DFID and DFID's culture. We have a British backbone. Downers. We have diversity within DFID, and I would say over the past 20 years, we have been bringing in a lot of people from the NGO communities who've got more of that. The livelihoods advisors, the social development advisors, I would say, probably do have that. Community, I can't say it anymore because of Terry. Yeah. But that sort of village level household sort of engagement with people's problems and those who are on the outside, because even within a village there are those people who don't have a say, don't have voice, and I think that is very much within our Bangladesh work and India work where we're trying to get to. We are secular. I mean, there is a division between politics and state, and we're a government department. And at the moment, the emergencies that we're dealing with around, Syria, northern Iraq, it's very difficult to sort of get that line right. Now, I don't know whether you're referring to an actual issue about a proposal that didn't get funded for. No, okay. I mean, eco-Islam, I don't know enough about, but I do completely understand that within culture and beliefs, you engage with religious beliefs as much as possible as you can, be that Christian or Islam. We are seeing, sort of from the West Africa that, sort of belief system can also undermine how you are doing things. You've got to get that balance right, and I don't think there's one answer to that. I think it has to be on a sort of case by case.
Focusing on the positive, you all said the negative, so it's not balanced.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but it's a pity. I hope that those of you who wanted to ask other questions, or you can intercept our panelists as you leave. But I wanted to thank you all for coming and to thank everyone online. Atiya, who is a PhD student at UCL, I'm very sorry we didn't have time for your question, but I hope that we can raise it. You can raise it in another forum. I wanted to say, too, that there are copies. We don't have enough hard copies of the report, but you can find it online. I believe there are also summaries in French, Arabic, and Spanish. And I wanted to make just a very quick announcement to take advantage of the opportunity to say that ODI's Climate and Environment Program will soon be releasing their new report, and Tom Mitchell heads up that program here, which is called Setting, Measuring, and Monitoring Targets for Disaster Risk Reduction, Recommendations for Post-2015 International Policy Frameworks. And I believe the executive summary is already available online, and the report will follow soon, so do have a look at that. And for the Humanitarian Practice Network, which I coordinate, we're revising our Good Practice Review on Disaster Risk Reduction, which will be published in March 2015. And we're lucky enough to have both Nick and Tim on our steering group, as well as a number of other people as well. So look out for that too. And again, thank you very much. You can watch the video of the event or refer others to watch the event online. And if you want to join us outside the room, those of you in the room, for refreshments and more networking, we'd be very happy to have you. So thank you very much, and thanks to our panelists.